Hey guys, and welcome to another of these streams where I go through Plutarch's lives. I started with Theseus and Romulus a while ago, and I wanted to just update that with the next one on the list, which is Lycurgus and Numa. And it's an interesting couple to follow, the Theseus Romulus one. In Theseus Romulus, we had a hero with a sense of destiny who was going out to form something new into the world, erect a city, or become a king, or become a leader of men in a more classical, heroic type. Neither of Lycurgus nor Numa generally fit this mold because they come after. Numa in particular comes after Romulus, but because they're coming after these great traditional heroes, I think Plutarch wants to set up a certain foil. So what they're doing more is, you see it with Lycurgus, he is the lawgiver, and Numa is also one who is a sort of lawgiver. He habituates practices, certain religious practices, and so on. So what you're trying to do is cement the soft culture and the soft power that had come with the sort of leader that we saw the first time, your Theseus Romulus. This is the after show where you need to cement up the culture. Now, let's crack into Lycurgus the Lawgiver, because this is our first introduction to Sparta, and he is the lawgiver of the laws to Sparta. And it's interesting, again, we're still in this man versus myth state, where it's difficult to pinpoint exactly when Lycurgus was around. Anytime between the 10th and 6th centuries BC seem to be up for grabs. Let's put him circa 780 BC, I think, for now. And there's this whole thing about, why did the customs of Sparta seem to change so much for me, say, as Thucydides or Herodotus in the Athenian age? Why did the laws of Sparta seem so different than that which Homer was portraying around Menelaus, Castor, and Pollux, and these sorts? And historians try to date that back to this idea of the Dorian invasion, which happened during the Greek Dark Ages. Details on it are still touchy, I think, as to whether or not it occurred or to what extent it was this return of the Heraclidae, the Estephiton Heraclidae, where the people who believed their lands should be in the Peloponnese came down from the Dorian lands to gain their right, so to speak. And Lycurgus is kind of wrapped up in this because he is the one who then, in terms of a singular character, we can see is implementing the laws of Sparta that were more in tune with the Thucydides and Herodotus that they would be more familiar with. And Herodotus himself then, Lycurgus himself then, he comes in as king of Sparta at this unknown date, as I specified, because his older brother Polyctides had become deceased. Now, it doesn't last because we find out Polyctides' wife, the still queen, is actually pregnant. So he's immediately thrust upon this situation of, does might make right here? He's in a situation where he could seize the crown himself and perhaps go on a more traditional hero route, but then would you be considered tyrant? And ultimately, there is this great morality in Lycurgus, whether you agree with it or not. The man is motivated by morals, very much a man of principle, not a man simply after power. And the queen was brought to bed of a boy, says Plutarch, who was soon after presented to him, being Lycurgus, as he was at the table, he taking him into his arms and said about him, Men of Sparta, here is a king born unto us. This said, he laid him down in the king's place and named him Caralaus. So Lycurgus does not use this opportunity to get rid of Caralaus, but actually will use Caralaus, as we see eventually, as a sort of personification of Sparta. He can use him as a symbol that through him he enacts the actual laws and the reforms. But first, after he says that Caralaus is king, I think he doesn't want to be seen to be the corrupting uncle is such a classic trope throughout Renaissance literature and going back even into antiquity, and it's because of situations like this. But Lycurgus then leaves and he goes on these travels, and during which he's meant to get all of these different perspectives, different ways of doing things, different modes and different customs. And he's meant to collect his best idea of, right, I'm going to take the best bits of all. And then eventually Sparta calls him back because they're saying, no, we're in a place of depravity. We need a leader. And so he goes back and then inculcates the laws. They were, I think, though, given to him by the Pythia, and that's what we see here in this painting by Delacroix, is Lycurgus consulting the Pythia, where he actually gets the confirmation of the laws. So it's a bit muddled, he goes around with the travels. Was it through these travels that he was picking up the same way Aristotle would have gone through is all these different constitutions, but it's still in the time of mythos. So you add this flavor of him actually being in tune more with the divine when he comes to these laws. It can't simply be that analytic process alone. He said that he sailed to Egypt and had consultation with Thales, not to be confused with the mathematician later, but this is a composer. And as we said, he was so much missed from Sparta that he was sent back for. Nor the kings themselves averse to see him back, for they looked upon his presence as a bulwark against the insolence of the people. So immediately you have an interesting way of phrasing the need for Lycurgus's return there by Plutarch, which is as a bulwark against the insolence of the people. Very much, exactly, he's not going to be democratic in what he does now. This is going to be the beginning of an autocratic rule. There still remains a question of when he returns. Is he enacting some sort of coup? Is it, there's an element of, is it the Glorious Revolution? Is it letting in William of Orange? Oh, please come in and save us. Or is it, there's a debate there in and of itself. Is that a coup? So obviously this is lost to myth, but I thought it was an interesting one. It says things being in this posture for his return, he applied himself without loss of time to a thorough reformation and resolved to change the whole face of the Commonwealth. Away he goes to Delphi to consult the Apollo there. Here's our painting. To bring over to his side the leading men of Sparta. So again, it kind of is a coup in a way, but I think he seems to have enough support from the leading men based on the information we have. But it's something to keep in our minds. Animated them all to put his design into execution. So he seems to have built up some sort of elite network there. When things were ripe for action, he gave the orders to 30 of the principal men of Sparta to be ready and armed at the marketplace by break of day. King Charalaus, apprehending that it was a conspiracy against his person, took sanctuary from the temple Minerva of the Brazen House, but being soon after undeceived and having taken an oath of them that they had no designs against him, he acquitted his refuge and himself also entered in the confederacy with them. So it's important then to incorporate the existing kingship rather than being seen as a usurper. Lycurgus does not want to be seen as that still. So then we have to talk about his actual reforms. They're usually subdivided into 5 separate styles of reform. His reform of the Senate, his reform of the land, which has interesting connotations in light of 20th century, if we think of agrarian reforms in the Soviet Union, currency, outlaw of superfluous arts, and the communal dining, which is one that most people remember. All of these you actually do see there was an idyllic version of this sort of inculcation both in mid-20th century, the mid-20th century Germans, and also an element of Stalin's Soviet Union. So it's interesting that Lycurgus still exists as this classical ideal, which you can, see them drawing inspiration from. The establishment of the Senate, and he wanted the Senate to be equal to the kings in power. One towards an absolute monarchy when the kings He wanted to lean one well towards an absolute monarchy when the kings had the upper hand, and another towards pure democracy when the people had the better. So he found this establishment of the Senate a central weight, in the words of Plutarch, like a ballast in a ship, which always kept things in a just equilibrium. And it numbered 28. There was Philis and Ubes, and they were meant to be divisions amongst the people by their leaders and their kings. Yet, I think eventually there was still the debate about this Senate. Did it become too oligarchical over time? and possibly, but there's a strike at wanting to get this equilibrium. I think we had it before with how Theseus had divided his place between the three different classes. There's always this great taxonomy of classes these leaders at this stage of Plutarch's great seem to want to do, and Lycurgus is no different to that. The Senate consisted of those who were Lycurgus's chief aiders and assistants in his plans. So I think what it says, like Plutarch later, the manner of their election was as follows. The people being called together, some selected persons were locked up in a room near the place of election, so contrived that they could neither see nor be seen, but could only hear the noise of the assembly without. For they decided this, as most other affairs of moment, by the shouts of the people. This done, their competitors were not brought in and presented all together, but one after another by lot. Those who were locked up had writing tables with them, in which they recorded and marked each shout by its loudness, without knowing in favor of which candidate each of them was made, but merely by that they came first, second, third, fourth, or so on. You can see this idea of the blind writer just hearing the shouts, okay, that guy was louder, that guy was louder, now he's elected, is ripe for corruption. And I'm sure if, even at this point of the mythos, if this was in any way accurate of what was genuinely going on, perhaps there was large elements of corruption there. So he inculcates the Senate. I think it's an instrument that Lycurgus probably feels that he can control, and that's why he brings it in. But you still have to have that appeal to the idea that I'm creating some sort of equilibrium or equality. There's still always this appeal of equality, but is it equality between absolute monarchy and democracy? Are you creating an oligarchy? There's always, if you look at two things, you can say you're creating an equality between them by creating a third thing. It does not mean that it's a universal equality, but you use it as a mediator between two things, and that gives a good sense of appeal to it in people's minds. So the second, we have the land reforms, the division of their lands, extreme inequality amongst them, and their state was overloaded with a multitude of indigent and necessitous persons, while his whole wealth had centered upon a very few, to the end, therefore, that he might expel from the state arrogance, envy, luxury, crime, and those yet more inveterate diseases of wanton superfluity. He obtained of them to renounce their properties and to consent to a new division of the land, and that they should live all together on an equal footing. And I just wrote next to this, Stalin, ? I thought it shows the extremes that Lycurgus was willing to go to. And this is where you see it in Stalin as well, with the decision to go through with the agrarian revolution, that it's a complete commitment to an ideal. Whether Lycurgus got this from a Pythia or whether he got it from some sort of sculpting or something he'd heard in his travels, what you see, though, is a man returned with a religious zeal to implement them. This would not have been a simple practice. And then this idea of superfluity and wanting to get rid of it. Think of as well with the communist regime that the capitalists were seen to be these sort of corrupt, decadent people, and then the communists in the Soviet Union would be pure, and that can be seen as this thing like what Lycurgus is getting at here, this stripping away of superfluity. So there is this strange overlap there. He also has the diffusion of money, so he gets the control of the money, and at once numbers of vices were banished from Lacedaemon, so says Plutarch. Outlawry of all needed superfluous arts. We see little reminiscence there of Plato's Republic. So there is always this Greek ideal of wanting to get rid of artists who bring with them some form of decadence, or some sort of distraction from the mode of being that you should be in the eyes of these leaders. And then we get to his fifth one, which is the communal dining hall. What he wants to do here is really create a mentality of the hive, right? Get rid of that sense of individuality. Nor were they allowed to take food at home first and then attend public tables, for every one had an eye upon those who did not eat and drink like the rest, and reproached them with being dainty and effeminate. So all of this is leading towards things where he is both communalistic but also militaristic. In the beginning of this mess hall, you're beginning to see this want of creating a sense of brotherhood and fraternity, so that when it comes to defending their homeland, they will be linked and know each other, know each other's movements as if they were one. Creation of this hive mentality as a defense mechanism almost. In terms of his character and his attributes, he had an opportunity to observe anyone who had an opportunity to observe him, and Plutarch uses this case of Alcander, that he was gentle, calm in temper, with extraordinary sobriety and an indefatigable industry. And so from an enemy became one of the most zealous admirers, this Alcander, and told his friends and relations that Lycurgus was not that morose and ill-natured man they had formerly taken him for, but the one mild and gentle character of the world. He did have to throw a few bones to the people. It couldn't all be austere. And he does this through public repasts and love feasts. So again, it's these feasts, it's these public demonstrations where everyone can act in a sense of community together. The custom of eating together was observed strictly for a great while afterwards, and so much that King Agus himself, coming centuries later, having vanquished the Athenians, sending for his commons at his return home because he desired to eat privately with his queen, was refused them by his polemarchs. So a sense of how long, the longevity and duration of these reforms, this fraternity that Lycurgus had built. Important thing to note is that he would never put these laws into a written constitution. This became later known as the Great Rhetra, where, rhetorical, think of someone speaking in oratory. And we already mentioned here the communalistic and militaristic twin sense of his reforms. So we get to the Great Rhetra. Now, because it's spoken there, you maintain this sense of the divine, I think, with it. Think of England, of course, famously doesn't have a written constitution, and yet it worked for centuries. There's always these debates now because we live in an age where everything needs to be written down or codified in a scientific manner. But here, Lycurgus is going at something divine with his laws, so he does not need it to be written down. And you can see through England that you can go a long time without having a written constitution in that sense. And so, though in this painting here by Jacopo Palma Il Vecchio, you just see some sort of book, there is no codified law of this. It is a great Rhetra. It was given to him by the Pythia at the Apollo Delphi, and it is simply a spoken Rhetra. The laws were called Rhetras to intimate that they were divine sanctions and revelations. So then there's some other parts we should talk about. How did women and children behave in these reforms of Lycurgus? Well, Plutarch says the following: for Aristotle is wrong in saying that after he had tried all ways to reduce women to more modesty and sobriety, he was at last forced to leave them as they were, because that in the absence of their husbands, who spent the best part of their lives in the wars, their wives, whom they were obliged to leave absolute mistresses at home, took great liberties and assumed the superiority. The truth, says Plutarch, is that he took it in their case and also the care that was possible. He ordered the maidens to exercise themselves in wrestling, running, throwing the quote, and casting the dart. So it was an intentional want that the women should also be able and physical and be able to defend the homeland. It's sort of like don't waste any breath in creating this communalistic enterprise. It wasn't a case of just men went off to war and then they were able to do whatever they wanted home, and they came back and they realized they couldn't tame them. Plutarch sides with the idea that this was top-down driven by men like Lycurgus the Lawgiver. Nor was there any shamefulness in nakedness among young women, and taught them simplicity and a care for good health. In their marriages, their husband carried off his bride by sort of force, nor were the brides ever small or out of tender years, but in full bloom and ripeness. Lycurgus allowed a man who was advanced in years and have a young wife, and recommend some virtuous and approved young man that she might have a child by him. So there's this weird sense of marriage where if an old man had a younger wife, he would still let her have a child by a younger man, because this sense of community had gathered to such an extent that it was like, no, you're giving a younger, fitter, more virile fighter for Sparta if you do it this way, which is very different culturally to what we're used to. But there we have it. And children, nor was it in the power of the father to dispose of the child as he thought fit. He was obliged to carry it before certain triers at a place called Lescia. So then we have this idea of, well, how much autonomy does a single household then have in these reforms by Lycurgus? The answer is very, very little. The children are put through this test or trial to see their fitness. Regardless, that is not a decision of the parent. Nor was it lawful indeed for the father himself to breed up the children after his own fancy. Again, think communalistic and militaristic. As they grew in years, their discipline was proportionately increased. Their heads were close clipped, and they accustomed to go barefoot and, for the most part, to play naked. Always one of the best and honestest men in the city was appointed to undertake the charge and governance of them. Plutarch doesn't really go into more detail on that. How are you deemed to be one of the best and honestest men of the city? Probably you're in the Senate, which is controlled by Lycurgus, and so it is still very autocratic. Lycurgus himself seems to have been short and sententious, but we've already established he could charm someone like Alcander to make him turn around. So he was clearly a charmer, clearly had some sense of invigoration when you were near them. You got compelled and swayed by their words. Charisma, in another sense. And of course, he said this whole idea was we fortify the city by men, not by walls. Get the men to be disciplined, and then there will be no need for walls. Oh, we're approaching the 20-minute mark, so I just want to say around Lycurgus, he thought there was a great importance of music, and one of the great reliefs he gave to the people was these festivals, these dancings, that in the Spear and Song, in her Do Meet Justice and Walks About the Street, is one of the first sayings of the Lacedaemon, that the rhythm of song and the fact you dance in unison could get you used to this idea of working in unison on the battlefield. So there was this twinned relationship between how you would behave in a feast, dancing around, or how you could behave in battlefield. There was formation and synchronicity to it. And indeed, Plutarch states this. When their army was drawn up in battle array, the enemy near, the king sacrificed a goat, commanded the soldiers to set their garlands upon their heads. Their pipers played the tune of the hymn of Castor, and himself began the paean of advance. So literally the idea of the marching band, which was still there going into the Great War at the beginning of the 20th century, that the marching band would be right up there with the main guys. You would play music to get people psyched up as well. He inculcated burials, this idea of what do you do with your dead. Spengler touches upon this as an important change in the Greek, that they inculcate this burning of the dead rather than the mummification that happens in Egypt. So it's always interesting when you see someone bring in reforms. What are they doing with burial system? Touching burials, Lycurgus made very wise regulations. For the first of all, to cut off superstition, he allowed them to bury their dead within the city, so still burying, and even round about their temples, to the end of their youth might be accustomed to such spectacles and not be afraid to see a dead body. So it was about exposure to death. Mourning was very short, 11 days, and on the 12th they were to do sacrifice to Ceres. He forbade them to travel abroad, and again, kind of sounds like a bit like 20th century communists, where I believe it was even Enver Hoxha, who was in charge of Albania, forbade his citizens to even swim in the sea for fear that they could swim to Corfu or swim to Greece. So you would acquaint yourselves with foreign rules of morality, according to Lycurgus, and this would be, this would be tainting your virtue. But Plutarch is very kind and considerate to Lycurgus. He says, I, for my part, see no sign of injustice or want of equity in the laws of Lycurgus, though some who admit them to be well contrived to make good soldiers pronounce them defective in points of justice. Anyone who was a slave there was the greatest slave in the world. For my part, I am of opinion that these outrages and cruelties began to be exercised in Sparta at a later time. So Plutarch is, from the vantage point of the 1st, 2nd centuries AD, is looking back at Sparta and saying, yes, there were corruptions, but they came in much later than Lycurgus. I actually believe in the time of Lycurgus that it was quite a just and equitable place. I cannot persuade myself to ascribe to Lycurgus wicked and barbarous course, judging of him from the gentleness of his disposition and justice upon all other occasions to which the oracle is testified. So then we have this idea of the lasting legacy of Lycurgus. He and his sort of death, he leaves to consult the Apollo. Lycurgus, viewing with joy and satisfaction the greatness and beauty of his political structure, now fairly at work and in motion, conceived the thought of making it immortal. Okay. And as far as human forecasts could reach, deliver it down to unchangeable to posterity. So he had this great Rhetra, and he wanted to keep it, even past his own life. And so there's this sort of contrived method at which he does so, where he heads out. They would observe that the laws without any least alteration until he returns. So he heads out, seek the Apollo. Set out for Delphi, and having sacrificed to Apollo, asked him whether the laws he had established were good and sufficient for a people's happiness and virtue. The oracle answered that the laws were excellent. Spartans should not be released from the oath they had taken, and that he would, of his own act, close his life where he was. So he said, when I'm going to Delphi to consult the Apollo, or the Pythia, and you will not change a single law I've inculcated while I'm away. He then finds out that according to Apollo, he's got the best laws ever. So he goes, okay, I'm going to mysteriously kill myself now, or have myself killed, and no one will be able to find my body. I'll never be able to return to Sparta. Thus, I will establish this enduring legacy of my laws, which is, again, absolute commitment. Commitment to the extent where you're going to never see your homeland again, in the belief that you've made them so rigorous and so dutiful to your laws that they will not break that oath. City of Lacedaemon continued chief city of all Greece for the space of 500 years, in strict observance of Lycurgus's laws, in all which time there was no manner of alteration made during the reign of the 14 kings, down to the time of Agis, the son of Archidamus. In the time of Agis, gold and silver flowed into Sparta. So Plutarch tries to pinpoint on why exactly, after so many centuries, did it begin to degenerate? Did they begin to move away from Lycurgus's laws? And he pinpoints this time of Agis. And with them almost mischiefs, the mischief of gold and silver come in, which attend the immoderate desire of riches. Lysander promoted this disorder, for by bringing in rich spoils from wars, although himself incorrupt, he yet by this means filled his country with avarice and luxury, and subverted the laws and ordinances of Lycurgus. So that's Lycurgus. And yeah, it's an interesting one. There's loads of different laws there. There's loads of different, some of them are very extreme, but also there is a nobility to it. There is an appeal to that sense of fraternity. Even in the French Revolution, they still need to appeal to that word fraternity, right? So if it was fraternité, égalité, liberté, this is just fraternité, and maybe the Senate can do an idea of égalité. We can say égalité with the reforms of the lands, but absolutely no liberté. None whatsoever. So how does Numa square up to that? So let's look at Numa Pompilius. He comes in to Rome after a year interregnum between this mysterious vanishing of Romulus that had occurred. And Romulus becomes Romulus Quirinius, the apotheosis of Romulus, as we had in the previous one. So Numa really inherits this state that has been an interregnum for a year, and the Sabines and the Roman factions are still quarreling with each other. And he is eventually brought in to alleviate the concerns. He's seen as a sort of middle ground way that there could be a king that both could be satisfied with. So I think he's inheriting a case far different to that of Romulus. Romulus is the 0 to 1. He erects the city, founds the city. Numa is inheriting a place divided by factions that's had a very successful king and then had a year of interregnum. You can consider this similar to Lycurgus in a way. Lycurgus comes back from his travels to find this place. It's more a place just become decadent, and that's all we kind of get from that. We don't get more information. But Numa knows particularly that there's these two factions. Now, he is of Sabine extraction. And again, the exact dates are muddled because Plutarch begins by saying the ancient registers of Rome are lost when the city was sacked by the Gauls. That's the 390 BC sack of the city by the Gauls. But Numa was descended by the Sabines, who declare themselves to be a colony of the Lacedaemons. It was the 37th year counted from the foundation of Rome, when Romulus, then reigning, did on the 5th day in the month of July, called the Capertine Nones, offer a public sacrifice at the Goat's Marsh, in presence of the Senate and the people of Rome. Suddenly the sky was darkened, a thick cloud of storm and rain settled on the earth, and the common people fled in affright and were dispersed. And in this whirlwind Romulus disappeared, his body being never found, either living or dead. So follow that, Numa. And Proclus, a man of note, took oath that he saw Romulus caught up in heaven in his arms and vestments. Hereafter they styled him Quirinus. So Romulus gets deified, and Numa has to come in after these factions develop. Romans make a choice of Sabines. Sabines name a Roman, basically. And then they settled with the Romans naming of this Sabine Numa. Sabines remitted the choice to the original Romans, and the consultations being accordingly held, they named Numa Pompilius of the Sabine race. He resided at a famous city of the Sabines called Cures, whence the Romans and Sabines gave themselves a joint name of Quirites. Hence this idea that he could be middle ground. He was also born on the 21st day of April, seen as the day of the foundation of Rome itself. So perhaps a portent that he could be a good king for them. Subdued by discipline and severe life, the study of philosophy. Yes. The character of Numa, right? The character of Numa is going to be similar enough to that of Lycurgus. He's not going to be a warrior. He's actually going to keep Rome from any battles. The only leader, never to fling open the temples of Janus, which basically means you're going to war. And I think it has to do with these factions he inherited. A very young Rome and a factious Rome. It will come apart unless you are of the character of Numa. That's why Plutarch's getting at here on his second couple. Austere, philosophical, and then religious, to the extent that you believe you've been touched by the divines. Numa, like Lycurgus believes he gets these laws from the Pythia, from Delphi. Numa believes he's in consultation with a muse called Egeria, which tells him how to create these religious institutions around Rome. Like Lycurgus, he banished all luxury and softness from his own home, and while citizens alike and strangers found him an incorruptible judge and counselor, would that translate to a city-wide, a city-statewide, which Rome is at this point, land? So this idea of him being in tune with Egeria, this is, if you look up paintings on Numa, this is what you'll find. A lot of the ideas that he's there with the nymph Egeria. This is Nicolas Poussin, 1631 to 33, all on canvas with the depiction of the idyllic Arcadian style land, because it's the nymph. You have Pan there in the background. But should we dismiss this idea that you're in tune with the gods? Plutarch, even in later time Plutarch, he does not think so. Why should we judge it incongruous that a like spirit of the gods should visit Seleucus, Minos, Zoroaster, Lycurgus, and Numa, the controllers of kingdoms and the legislators of the commonwealths? Greatness in Plutarch, certainly in these moments of his early lives, need to be touched by a deity. So Numa was about 40 years of age when the ambassadors came to make him the offer of the kingdom, which is important. He was a fully formed individual. He would not be corrupted by anyone. He had made up his own mind of how he was going to rule. My birth was mortal, he said, though he is in consultation with the gods. The very points of my character that are most commended mark me as unfit to reign. This is the follow Romulus. Can you do that? The next thing he did was to add 2 priests. Okay, so I start talking about things that he does. He adds to the 2 priests of Jupiter, this one of Mars. He's going to go, okay, following Romulus, this guy disappeared in a dust bowl up into the sky. He's known as Romulus Quirinus, with an equation now to Mars. So what he does is he adds a priest to Mars in honor of Romulus that is of the same level as those that are already there for Jupiter, whom he called the Flamen Quirinalis. Immediately that's going to satisfy, because I think he is a Sabine, so that will keep the Sabine faction a bit more with him. But there's still probably parts of the Roman faction, though they nominated him, that he needs to placate. that he needs to say, I'm your guy. And he does that through this inculcation of Romulus Quirinus being given a priesthood the same level as the two for Jupiter. And he then sets up more institutions around priesthood. The original constitutions of priests, called pontifices, is ascribed into Numa, and he himself was, it is said, the first of them, that they have this name of pontifices from potens. And you can think of this as the pontiff. It comes all the way down to the Pope being known as pontiff today in terms of language. So you can trace that all the way back to Numa if you want, because they attended the service of the gods. And there's this idea of the Pontifex Maximus, or chief priest, who was to declare and interpret divine law. Think of what the Pope is said to do for the Catholic Church. Preside over the sacred rites. So there's still this, in humanity on this Italian peninsula, even going back this far, steeped with pagan beliefs, that he's getting these laws from a nymph called Egeria. There's still this, when you get to institutionalizing things, ways which men need to institutionalize things. And his creation of the Pontifex Maximus is similar to what we still have today. We mentioned in the Romulus piece that he had this good idea of establishing the vestials for women to go into and become quite religious, and it would be a good outlet for them. But sources are split, I think, on whether Romulus or Numa actually did this. And Plutarch throws Numa a bone in this passage. The statutes prescribed by Numa are the vestals were these, that they should take a vow of virginity for the space of 30 years, the first 10 of which they were to spend in learning their duties, and second 10 in performing them, and the remaining 10 in teaching and instructing others. This is how he's going to use his women. Remember, Lycurgus lets them go quite wild and fierce, or at least strong. Numa goes for the more reserved, beautiful role for them. And this split of 10 and 10 is interesting. You see it in a lot of things, like spend a third of your time with people under you, third with people on your same level, and a third with people above. Because when you're spending it below, you're instructing. When it's people with, you're learning and collaborating. And you're just collaborating, right? Or you're learning a little bit, you're bouncing ideas off each other. And when you're doing above, that's when you're seeing where you need to get to next. So it's kind of like that. It's still a great practice today. It is said also that Numa built the Temple of Vesta, which was intended as a repository of the Holy Fire, a circular form. So all of what Egeria is telling him to do around Rome is, around these religiosities, cement the culture, ease the factions. And indeed, we begin to get, he inculcates the Sali, this leaping priests, just another form of priesthood that he brings in. The Temple of Vesta we already had. Plutarch goes on a little bit about the origin of the Sali, but we'll leave that for now. After Numa had in this manner instituted these several orders of priests, he erected near the Temple of Vesta what is called to this day the Regia, or King's House, where he spent most of his time performing divine service. So he isolates himself in this house performing divine service, creating this sort of mythos around, well, what's he actually doing in there, But he withdraws. It's a great withdrawal. It's not about presenting yourself to the people. It's about presenting temples, presenting orders of priesthood to the people. He saw himself as a lawgiver and wants to habituate the use to make our petitions to the deity, not by the way and as it were in a hurry, when we have other things to do, but with time and leisure to attend it. And so this is what he's taught about peace and war. He begins to, now you can say he goes too far in this because you still need to defend your lands, right? We were at length to talk about how much Romulus was in a time of tumult and really needed to assert his authority. So yes, ease the factions, Numa, but don't go so far. I think we have some other pictures of him with Egeria, or Egeria. Apologies for the misspelling there. But yeah, so has he gone too far in wanting this retreat? Would there be a time for defense? He gets away with it in some sense. And that's when Plutarch brings in this idea of the temple of Janus. It said that he also built the temples of faith in Terminus and taught the Romans that the name of faith was the most solemn oath they could swear. They still use it to the god Terminus or boundary. They offer to this day both public and private sacrifices. And here's his fall to Romulus. Romulus would have but openly betrayed how much he had encroached on his neighbor's lands, but Numa does not want to do so. There is no employment that gives so keen and quick a relish for peace as husbandry and a country life. Think of Romulus as Virgil's, encompassing the morality of Virgil's Aeneid almost, whereas Numa is much more the eclogues. He's much more the Georgics. Let's retreat to the land. Let's have agrarian. Let's have an agrarian lifestyle. Numa, therefore, hoping agriculture would be a sort of charm to captivate the affections of his people to peace, and viewing it rather as a means to moral than to economical profit, similar to Lycurgus, divided all the lands into several parcels, to which he gave the name of pagus or parish. Again, parish, that sort of language we get, pontiff, parish, all still coming from the old Roman terms which they ascribed to what Numa had begun. Putting people into professions in peacetime, he thought, could create, again, it's this idea of how do I create fraternity? Lycurgus had his own methods, Numa has his as well. Lycurgus is much more militaristic, driven towards this idea of fraternity through war, fraternity through fortitude. Numa thinks fraternity through religious rites, solemnity, and peace, a withdrawing. We let people know their professions, and all factions and distinctions will begin for the first time to pass out of use, and no person any longer being either thought of spoken under the notion of Sabine or Roman. If I get them to think of themselves as a farmer or as other professions are listed here, carpenters, a dryer, a shoemaker, a skinner, and then we all go to and have the same worshiper and the same temples, this is how we're going to overcome the factions. It then introduces a better form of calendar. Added 2 months of January and February. And February comes from Februar, which is as much a purification month. So he says, I'm going to bring in these months which we're completely dedicated to this. In it, they have offerings to the dead and celebrate the Lupercalia, which in most points resembles a purification. Janus, whether in remote antiquity he were a demigod or a king, was certainly a great lover of civil and social unity. His temple at Rome has 2 gates, which they call the gates of war. And when they stand open, it is a time of war. And it is only during the reign of Numa, we alluded to this earlier, that those gates were never open for a single day. So his is a life of the quiet tillage of soil, the bringing up of children, and the worship of gods. So then we talk about legacy. We can wrap up here this idea of legacy of these laws. So we've had the 2 lawgivers, Lycurgus and Numa. Carlyle alludes to this when he talks about his lectures on great men. It is the fortune of all great men that their good virtues rise in glory after their deaths, and that the envy which evil men conceive against them never outlives them long. So Numa's laws last. The parish, the pontiff, they're still lasting. And Plutarch gives the example of Tullus Hostilius as an example of person whose laws does not last, that immediately succeeded Numa, derided his virtues, and especially his devotion to the religious worship, as a cowardly and mean-spirited occupation. Yet Tullus Hostilius's own inculcations have not lasted. And that's, I think, what Lycurgus was fearing when he said, if I came in and immediately overcame Catalaus, the boy king, I'd be seen as the tyrant. I'd be cast as this sort of Tullus Hostilius, and none of the reforms I wanted to make would last beyond my lifetime. So we do have the surviving comparison that Plutarch made between these 2. Their moderation, their religion, their capacity of government and discipline, they're both deriving their laws and constitutions from the gods. Numa accepted and Lycurgus resigned a kingdom. Numa received without desiring it. Lycurgus had it and gave it up. It was glorious to acquire a throne by justice, yet more glorious to prefer justice than a throne. And we do get that. We have that sense in Numa where he still goes, here, I I'm not fit for this. Even though he accepts it ultimately, he does say, I'm not fit for this. I am but a mortal. Numa is a bit more effeminate, you could say, than Lycurgus. I think that's fairly fair to say. And he brings in this bit about the marriage rituals in Rome, does Plutarch here. He says, Romans gave their daughters in marriage as early as 12 years old or even under, as they thought their bodies alike and minds would be delivered to the future husbands pure and undefiled. Numa left the whole matter simply to be decided by the parents' wishes or necessities. We see this as completely different to Lycurgus. So there is actually more of a laissez-faire element with Numa, which wouldn't be difficult because Lycurgus is everything is, we're going to be a hive, we're going to be worker bees here. Numa's whole design and aim to continuance of peace and goodwill on his death vanished with him. No sooner did he expire in his last breath than the gates of Janus temple flew wide open, whereas Lycurgus, with his cunning way of how I'm going to wrap up my life, I'm going to go to Apollo, they keep the oath, they can't change the laws, and then I disappear. It actually works, and Plutarch calls him out as being like, yeah, I think Lycurgus pulled a very clever move here. For Lycurgus, that the Romans had deserted the doctrine. However, it makes much for Lycurgus that after the Romans had deserted their doctrine and discipline of Numa, their empire grew and their power increased so much, whereas so soon as the Lacedaemonians fell from the institution of Lycurgus, they sank from the highest to the lowest state, and after forfeiting their supremacy over the rest of Greece, were themselves in danger of absolute extirpation. But I think this is how Plutarch concludes it. I think it's a little harsh on Numa. He settled the Sabine-Roman dispute, which then gave the space for expansion. If you had tried to expand on top of that, your internal factions may have destroyed your entire civilization and nipped it in the bud. So a bit more in defense of Numa am I than Plutarch seems to be. And that's it. Let me know what you thought of Lycurgus and Numa. Let me know if you think, whose regime would you rather live under? whose methods make more sense to you? Are they both so foreign? And then next time we're gonna be on Solon and Poplicola. So until then, guys, see ya.